Ready? Okay, well, there was the "whenever you're ready" message from the man who has the authority to say that. So. Well, I've had a wonderful feast. This is somehow already the last seminar, I guess, of the feast here. So it's a pleasure to be with all of you this year. I think we've had, if you rank the feast on spiritual growth as well as growth in fellowship, we've had really a great feast this year. So it's been great to be with all of you. So the benefit to having the last message is my benefit, really, because I get to draw on all of the wonderful things that have already been said. And there has been so much already said. I told Leo the other day, I think it was Tuesday, when he gave his message, that it was kind of a preface to this topic here, which was Revelation 22, the warning not to add or take away from the book. But yet we kind of want to know these secrets and what else is in the Bible that's not really in the Bible, right? And so the secret is really to fear the Lord, and the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And so we're going to ask a few questions today that we have to go to other sources to maybe get some ideas of what could be, or what could, it could be some answers, and there's some maybes and stuff. And I don't ever want to give the implication that any of that supersedes the Bible. In fact, actually, the message from today is going to be that we can always trust God's promises. I want to encourage you in that God's promises are going to always be true. And we'll see that His promises are true. So we're going to continue encouraging you today, just as you have been. So, my interest in history, this would be kind of a history study for those of you who like that sort of thing. And if you're familiar with Stephen Collins' work on the Lost 10 Tribes of Israel, some of this will seem familiar then. But my interest in history is really to learn his story, which is to learn how God's hand has been active in the affairs of men. Really, the whole theme of the book of Daniel, right? What did Daniel say? That God rules in the affairs of men. And that's really where history touches my heart in whatever way it comes, whether it's some archaeological find or some, whatever. How does it honor Him, and how does it praise God? So right here, this is a familiar scene. So I got a Christmas card a few years ago. I don't know if you guys get Christmas cards. I love to get Christmas cards because it's a symbol. It's a symbol of a good relationship. I don't send them back, but somebody sends me one. In this case, a local business sent me a card of appreciation for doing business with them through the year. And I thought, what a familiar scene. And it kind of got my interest that I could immediately see. I know several things that are wrong with this, but how much do I know about this story? And so let's take a few minutes and see what can we learn more about the story. So we're going to read here. This is the only slide with lots of words. So Matthew chapter 2. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king is an important figure here. Behold, okay, get your attention, pay attention to this. Behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. So we're going to notice wise men and from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." They have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled. And every translation says, greatly afraid, troubled, deeply disturbed. And not only Herod, but all of Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And so they said to him in Bethlehem of Judea, and he told them the prophecy that the shepherd would come to Israel. Shepherd would come to Israel. Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared, and he sent them to Bethlehem, and he said, "Go and search carefully for the child." And of course, he was deceptive in his instruction, but he still says, "When you have found him, bring him back that I may also worship him." We know he was lying, but he was appealing to their intention. And when they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them, and it came and stood over where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. It does say house, not manger. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold and frankincense and myrrh. 3 gifts, not necessarily 3 guys. And then, being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their country another way. So there's the story, and you know the story. And this, interestingly, this comes in the book of Matthew, and in no other gospel account. In Luke, it tells of the shepherds coming to the newborn babe, but it's in Matthew, which I think has a meaning to it as well. If you look at the theme of the book of Matthew, it is that Christ came as the King of Kings. And if you look in the lineage that's given in Matthew, it's that he is delineated from David and has the authority as a king. And so here we find, in the very beginning of the New Testament, the story that these ancient kingmakers came to worship a king. And it wasn't their normal habit to worship their kings, but they came to worship this king. So first, let's ask some questions. Who are the wise men, or magi, as they've been called? They've even been called kings, but who were they? And why should we care about their story? And why in the world, as I was just talking to Brian a minute ago, he's been reading how ruthless King Herod was. Why in the world would ruthless King Herod care anything at all, let alone be greatly afraid about 3 weary travelers that came to Jerusalem? And if you believe the pictures, why would they care about these 3 guys dressed in women's clothes who came to Jerusalem? I mean, why would he even care? Why would he even notice? Right? And why would all of Jerusalem be afraid with him? It was obviously important because the Lord put this story right here. So let's take a look and let's ask a couple of questions. Who or what are wise men? Second of all, what is the East? And I'm going to add a third question. Why worship? Why was worship included in their intention? So let's first dispel some 3 myths. There were not 3 of them. They weren't kings, and so much for we 3 kings of Orient are. And, where do we get our ideas? We get our ideas from any place other than the Scripture, then they're prone to be wrong ideas. We have a lot of Christmas cards, modern art, and we've even got the 3 wise guys. I mean, the legitimate 3 wise guys. We had some wise guys here earlier, but we really do have. I mean, what more do you need? They didn't come to the manger, but they came to a house. And they weren't Gentiles, but they were Israelites. A lot of art, this is Renaissance art. Actually, this is prior to Renaissance. This is from the 6th century. There have been hundreds and thousands of sculptures and images, shrines, paintings done to these guys. The story, the legend is that these 3 men represent the whole world, right? So they even have names. These names are Caspar, Balthazar, and Melchior. You may have heard those names. There's no connection to any actual events. This all came centuries later. A lot of it came up from the Roman Catholic Church. That there were 3 in number, but there really weren't 3 in number. There were 3 gifts, and so that's how we get this idea that there were 3. That they came representing the 3 sons of Noah, and so therefore representing the entire earth coming, as a metaphor, so to speak, to come and worship the king. So there's usually someone that represents Africa. I lost my earpiece here. Somebody represents Africa, somebody represents Asia, somebody represents, whatever else. But these are traditions, right? These are just traditions. And in fact, someone even discovered their skulls. Some bishop of Rome discovered these he dug up these 3 skulls hundreds of years later, and he obviously knew that they were the 3 wise men. And so they put I suppose their eyes were looking toward Jerusalem, and so he knew that they were the 3 wise men. And so this is an actual gold shrine made by the premier goldsmith of the time, and it still exists. It's in a shrine in a cathedral in Rome today, or not in Rome, but in Europe today. So why were they there? They were there to worship. It says in verse 2 of chapter 2, we have come to worship him. And Herod acknowledges that in verse 8, and he says, come back and tell me so I can also go and worship him. And the intention of worship is important here. That he is the king that has been born, but he is also worthy of worship. He is a king in a royal line, and we know that from the text, and they knew it also. They were ancient kingmakers. And so to understand this, we kind of have to do a little bit of a history study. And as I said before, my interest in history is really to show his story. So where did they come from? They came from the east. The east of what? So the story takes place, of course, in Syria, Palestine, modern-day Israel, Judea, Jerusalem, this kind of an area, right? Which is the eastern edge of the Roman Republic, and in the days of this story, the newly formed Roman Empire. And it is right on the border of the east. So what is, in fact, called the east is the border where the Euphrates is. So, the Euphrates was a natural border for whatever empire, whether it was the Medes, the Persians, or the Parthians in this case, for hundreds and hundreds of years. And at this time, the Euphrates was also the border between Rome and Parthia. So the Parthian Empire. Have you ever heard of the Parthian Empire? Yes, you guys are students of history, right? You guys are students of the Bible. But, I had never heard of the Parthian Empire. That's because our history books have totally failed us. In the late 18th century, this guy, his name is George Rawlinson. He was a well-respected, probably the best known historian of ancient history, and he was a professor at Oxford. He wrote volumes and volumes on ancient history, including Parthia, and the travels of the Scythian people, a lot of people who we can understand to be Israelite peoples. And he wrote that the writers of Roman history, this is to answer the question of what have our history books done to us, that writers of Roman history have been too much in the habit of representing the Roman Republic and Empire as a universal monarchy, unchecked in their power. And he says, but there was always in the world a second power, which in a true sense balanced Rome. And this power for nearly 3 centuries was Parthia. Parthia is a key to understanding this story. When we look at the east, when the wise men came from the east, they came from east of the Euphrates, which was from Parthia. Okay, let's ask about the Magi. So the word that is wise men is magos, magi. It is an untranslatable word. It does not mean wise men. It does not mean kings. It means magi. It is a word that was later devolved into, like magician and magic, and there are reasons for that. But the word here is a very special tribe of people. And this is important. The Magi were a hereditary priesthood. Notice that. That's important. And they held a very powerful part of the nobility for centuries in the East. Even prior to the Parthian Empire rising, they were kingmakers of ancient empires, starting with the Medes and the Persians, and later in the Parthian Empire. So they were extremely old tribe of people. We see them appear in the time of Persia. In fact, Daniel interacts with them famously in the 400s BC. They were extremely influential. They had great power, and they're identifiable throughout writings as magi or magus or magos in old writings and in stone memorials and carvings. And you find them in the ancient royal courts. In fact, in Jeremiah 39, verses 3 and also in verse 13, you see Nergal-Sharezer was mentioned by name as the chief of the Magi, and he was in the royal court of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. So it goes even back prior to, just prior to even to Cyrus coming. And he is named as one of the principal officials in the court. So they had influence in the very court of Nebuchadnezzar. In Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 4, we're introduced to them in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. The word magicians is used, astrologers, Chaldeans, magi. These are almost synonyms. And in Daniel chapter 5, Daniel was made chief of the magi. He was set up to be the chief of all of the, what we call wise men or the magicians, but it was the magi. It was the ruling class that influenced the court of Nebuchadnezzar and of the Persian kings that followed. Daniel was their chief. And he was made the chief, and he likely had their respect. Because if you remember, it wasn't the magi, it wasn't the magicians who set up the plot against Daniel. It was the politicians of the day, right? It was the satraps, those governors who also wanted his authority. And so as far as we know, there is very little to believe that the Magi had anything, wrong thoughts against Daniel. We know that from the ancient writings that their belief system was kind of a mixture of all of the religions that the empire absorbed, including astrology and Zoroastrianism and Mithraism, household idols of the absorbed peoples, but there was also an element of Judaism in there as well. And it's very likely that Daniel influenced that. He was a major influence on that. So notice some similarities. The religion of the Magi to the religion of Israel. Fire was a chief element of their worship. They say a perpetual flame existed, which was sent down from heaven. There was a sacrificial system where animals were eaten by the worshiper. They had, significantly, there was a hereditary priesthood. They were a hereditary priesthood. They believed in a kind of clean and unclean animals. They were somewhat realistic about death and judgment compared to other nations. They abstained from touching dead bodies. They were monotheistic. These are unusual things. These are things that we find in the religion of the Israelites. They believed in angels, in demons, and a Savior. Now, these were twisted beliefs, but you can find elements mixed in there. And they, interestingly, as we see in 1 Chronicles 6, where the Levites, the hereditary priesthood of Israel, occupied their own cities. They had exclusive use of entire cities, and so did the Magi. They were so powerful in the Middle East that no Persian was able to become the ruling king in the empire unless he first mastered the scientific and religious discipline of the Magi, which was called the law of the Medes and the Persians. And you've heard that expression, the law of the Medes and the Persians. It's referred to in Esther, it's referred to in Daniel, and it was essentially the wisdom of the Magi. And it may well be that which was taught to Daniel and his young friends when they were originally taken there. The Magi, we know, controlled the judicial office. They were also kind of a part of a bicameral legislature, like a Senate and a second party. This goes all the way back to those days, and they had a lot of power for more than just setting up the kings, but what they're most notably known for here is they were alone able to approve and also to depose kings. Now, they didn't, to whatever power they could. Some of the kings became extremely despotic and tyrannical, but there are records where the Magi overthrew the king, and they had the authority to do so. It was not easy, but that was one thing that they could do to keep the king in check. And no one in these ancient empires ruled without the approval of the Magi. They were kingmakers. And so Daniel rises to be, do they look like this? I don't know. We kind of got to break down this barrier, right? This image of these three guys on the Christmas card. Daniel rises to be the chief, from Nebuchadnezzar to Cyrus the Great. And it's quite likely that he would have had some influence on their beliefs in a coming Messiah, in a prophecy even of when he would come. Maybe Daniel even told them his 70 weeks prophecy and explained it to them, so they had something to look exactly forward to. The son of David who was to be born in Bethlehem. And so Daniel might have continually reminded them of promises that God made that he would eventually keep, that God always keeps his promises, such as David always having an heir on the throne over the house of Israel. Well, speaking of the house of Israel, there were several promises that God made. God made promises that the descendants of Isaac would become an innumerable multitude. In Genesis 15:5, count the stars if you can, so will your descendants be, was told to Abraham. And already during the early days of King David, this was becoming true. When David took his census in David's time, we're going back a long ways now already, to the time of David. There were 800,000 soldiers of Israel and 500,000 soldiers of Judah. And during the time of Solomon's reign, it says that Israel and Judah were as numerous as the sand of the sea in multitude. And the northern house of Israel was taken captive by the Assyrians. But just prior to that happening, there was a horrific battle that's recorded in 2 Chronicles 28, where 120,000 men of Judah were killed in one battle in one day, and another 200,000 were carried away captives. Interestingly, they were returned with food and clothing because the tribal leaders, Israel was falling apart. They were worshiping false gods, but the tribal leaders still had some reverence for God. They feared God more than the king did. And so they said, no, we must not do this. They disobeyed the king. They said, we're going to send our brethren back. They sent them back with food and clothing. And the people of Israel listened to them, to their tribal leaders. And some of them believed and heard the prophet Hosea, who brought his warning that God was going to judge them. And so you have some sense of how big the nation was, even hundreds of years before this time. And yet, the Assyrian records show that when Assyria was captured, he took 27,000 and some captives. And you think, where'd everybody else go? There's a whole bunch of others. Well, the question is easy if you look at it on a big scale. So they went all over, and we're not going to get into all that today, but they went all over, and they started leaving long before the captivity. There's evidence of the Israelites in Carthage and in Scythia and Britain and all over the place. And Parthia is one of those places where we see the Israelites show up. We see that at the time of Parthia's greatest extent, that they had a very large empire, and there were very many people there. One of these places was around the Caucasus Mountains, which was where we get the name Caucasian people, along the steppes of Russia. They went all over this area around the Caspian Sea, and this area had been controlled by the Medes, but then after some time, if we fast forward to about 250 BC, the Parthians themselves revolted against their captors or against the ruling people, and they took their own name and they took their own country. And these people that were ruled by the Medes and Persians were the Magi that ruled them were the most powerful nobility in that empire. And so, we go back to the question, why don't our history books say this? Well, we have to not look for we have to not take a minimalist approach at where the Israelites went, because there was an innumerable multitude of them. God said there would be, even in the time, not just in the future, but in previous times. And we see that there were many people. So we can look and see, well, where did they go? And we can see that they went in one place to Parthia. We see in history that they show up about the time of the captivity in Judah. But not earlier than David and Solomon. The Parthians appear in history at the time when the Israelites dispersed. And in fact, they had many allies also of Israelite peoples. The Scythians were peoples that also had a lot of evidence that they were Israelites as well, which we won't talk about today. But they were cousins. They were actually shared a common language. They shared the same fashion with Scythians peoples, and they were Scyths in habits and character, according to the historian that I mentioned earlier, George Rawlinson. God made a promise. I want you to remember that God always keeps His promises, even the little promises. So when you read a promise like this, you say, well, I think God is going to keep His promises. But let's show that God always keeps His promises. God made a promise to Abraham. If you remember the story, Abraham was nervous about the future for Ishmael, right? He was nervous that something bad would happen to Ishmael, and God said, don't worry about Ishmael, I'm going to take care of him. He's going to be a nation of his own. Let Hagar and Ishmael go, and don't worry about them. He gave him the best advice he could. He said, listen to your wife and Sarah, and do what she says. Okay? That's what he told him. He says, do what she says. For in Isaac your seed shall be called. In Isaac your seed shall be called. There's kind of a fascinating development on this. The name Isaac shows up throughout the Parthian peoples. And not only them, but others as well. Jesus was a candidate for the thrones of Parthia and Scythia because he was descended from the kings of David, from the kings of Israel. The rulers of these nations had names incorporating the word Pharez. Pharez was a descendant of David. Pharez, such as some of the kings that appear in our story here, Phrates, and other ways that the word is developed, indicating that Parthia's ruling family were very likely of David's line. And the fulfillment of this prophecy is in the name of the first king of the Parthians and the city on which he was throned. It's called Artaxerxes. And the city itself is called, I'll pronounce it wrong, but Azak or Azak. And so you see that the name comes through. And the prophecies that God said the scepter would be given to Judah, that in Genesis 49, that these things came to pass, and they have always been true. The East Parthian province was called has a name that looks like Isaac. The name of the city where he was throned was the name that looks like Isaac, especially the sound. If you just don't look at the exact spelling, but the sound is very similar. And Josephus wrote in the Wars of the Jews that he wrote this in Hebrew. This is fascinating to me. I didn't know this until I started researching this topic. He wrote the Wars of the Jews in Hebrew for the Parthians, and then he translated it to Greek so that everyone else could read it, so that everyone else could understand it. And by the way, he also states as a fact, kind of just in passing as a comment, in Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 11, he says that the 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates until now and are an immense multitude and not to be estimated in numbers. So saying that they were across the Euphrates would be like saying, across the Red River. You'd know I was talking about going into Oklahoma, right? I mean, it's like saying, I'm going to go across the Red River. or across the Rio Grande, right? You know what I'm talking about when he says this border river, they were across there. They were in the east, which was at the time, as you saw on the big map, a very powerful nation called Parthia. These were Israelite peoples. Well, let's fast forward our story just a little bit. So, as I mentioned earlier, in about 250 BC, there's this man with the name of Artaxerxes. This kind of sounds like Isaac to me. He became the first king of Parthia, and all the Parthian kings for the next 300 years took his name. So you have Artaxerxes II and Artaxerxes III and so on. They also retained their own names, so we know who they were and we can differentiate them. Interestingly, the coins are a large part of what we have. Every king had his own image on the one side, and then most of the reverse images that I've seen on their coins are very similar to this one. So it's like the back of the coin often represented the original coin here. And the name Artaxerxes, which is a form of Isaac, is on every one of these coins. As George Rawlinson said, they were a power unchecked. And for 300 years, they kept Rome in check. 6 times during history, just prior to the birth and the arrival of Jesus, the Romans offensively invaded Parthia. They sent expeditions into Parthia to try to increase their territory and conquer the nation. And 5 times, of course, the first 5 times, they were crushed. Eventually, they did succeed. Later after our story, this was in the long after Bible times. But they were crushed by Parthians whenever they tried to come into their nation. And just prior to the coming of the Magi to worship Jesus, in 63 BC, in 53, and in 40, the 2 empires collided. And where do they fight? What is right in between? Jerusalem. In 53 BC, if you are a history nerd like I am, you remember this is the time of Julius Caesar. Okay, and so you have these really powerful men trying to gain power for themselves over the Roman Republic. And eventually, what happened was Rome became the empire that Caesar was a leader of. One of the men that was kind of vying for the leadership of Rome was a man named Crassus. And he took the offensive and he crossed into Parthia. He crossed the Euphrates. He attacked Parthia in an attempt for conquest and to one-up Caesar, known as the Battle of Carrhae. It was a total disaster that's written about in history books even today. They were totally wiped out, and the Parthians lost 50 men. 43,000 Roman soldiers went across, and they were totally defeated. And it was not due to to the leader not being competent. It was exactly the opposite. So there was a real battle going on, and they were a real power. That's kind of what I want you to learn here, is that the Parthian Empire was very strong. And in fact, when this guy here became king, it was in about 40 BC. Okay, so this was King Herod was alive during this time when Phraates IV came. He was a cruel and tyrannical man. He would have, if only he and Herod could have got along, they would have been 2 peas in a pod. But he crossed the Euphrates and attacked, and Parthia conquered Jerusalem. And for 3 years during Herod's early reign, Parthians ruled Jerusalem. Did you know that? And they set up a puppet king there to occupy Jerusalem while the Romans tried to figure out what to do. And The man who had just been set up as the ruler of Judea was Herod, the ambitious and ruthless man Herod, who came back, and 3 years later he retook Jerusalem, and he retook for himself the title King of the Jews and King of Judea. But he would forever remember that the Parthian Empire had once taken away his title and his crown. And he would never forget it. This is a famous stone relief in Iran. This was an inscription. This is Cyrus the Great. He is conquering 10 nations. He's standing on one of the kings, and there are others lined up to come to him. The last one is said to be of the Scythian peoples, which were the cousins that I mentioned earlier of the Parthians. They were basically shared the same language, the same dress, the same customs. They had a lot in common, according to history. And so there you have basically the Magi in the presence of Cyrus the Great. The Magi were a powerful body, and they were even down into the time of the Parthians as well. So, some people might say, well, that these were a backward people, they were barbarian people. Their culture, records of their culture, totally disputes that. Many Roman history books paint them as a barbaric people, but I wanted you to always contrast what you read with what the Bible says. So let's just read what Colossians 3:11 says. We can take this out of context first, which is Paul is saying he's making a contrast of opposites, right? Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, slave or free. These are opposites. Like he's obviously contrasting black and white here. Barbarian or Scythian, right? So without knowing context at all, you can clearly see here that Paul claims that these peoples across the Euphrates were not really barbarians. But then let's also take this scripture in context and realize that when we think about where the actual tribes of Israel are, where the nation of Israel is, it's interesting and it's intriguing, but how much does it really matter, right? Because in the end, Paul is saying here, we take this in context now again, there is no Gentile or Jew. There is no circumcised or uncircumcised. There is no barbarian or Scythian. There's no slave or free. But Christ is all in all. So it is our relationship with Him that really is what matters the most, not necessarily what our ancestral lineage is, where we come from. Is we are all grafted onto the vine if we come to Christ. So anyway, we want to just kind of paint you this picture of who this powerful army was, this powerful nation with a powerful army, and also these people called the Magi, who were a ruling nobility. What do they have to do with this story from here? Okay, if we keep going in history, we have this guy here. And I have some of these coins if you want to look at them later. These are little silver coins. They're not as big as that. They're just little bitty guys. But this was Phradius IV. He was a sweetheart. He killed his brother. I'm trying to remember now. It's hard to remember because the story of these guys gets all mixed up because they all were just ruthless people. But his brother died, and then he murdered his father. He murdered 30 brothers. Oftentimes they would murder cousins and uncles, and sometimes even there were assassinations by the Queen Mother and son. I mean, it's just you read this history of these guys, it's just terrible. And what happened here, though, was that this guy ruled until the time of Christ's birth. He ruled until about the year, 5 BC to 2 BC. And then he died. And you know how he died? Well, actually, his mother killed him. And then put another one of her sons on the throne. So I guess he got a taste of his own medicine there. But he had just recently been deposed. And I don't think the other brother, did I say brother? I'm not sure, I don't remember who put on the throne. They were trying to put someone else on the throne, but what was happening here was that there was kind of a turmoil going on, and the Parthian Empire, this great nation, was looking for a king. And whose job was it to find the king? They could elect one. It didn't have to be a son, it didn't have to be, like a closest relative like we see in England. It could be anyone who was a descendant of the household. But the Magi were the ones who set them up as a king. And so sometimes, actually, what you see in history, the Parthians would send their sons or their cousins or places to faraway lands. They would send them to other nations to protect them from assassinations. And so then you see sometimes going back to Rome even and bringing possible heirs to the throne back to Parthia to make them kings. And so they were looking for a king. And we know that Daniel would have told them his own prophecy. And we know that they would have known what it meant, that they were looking for a king, but this king was going to be worthy of worship. He was going to be special. So you see, as many problems as there were in their nation, and there were many, many problems, political problems and all kinds of problems, that there was still a remnant within the ruling class. There was still a remnant within the Magi who believed in the one true God, that worshiped the one true God. Because God promised that He would always have a king over the house of Israel. And so that's what I mean. We kind of get into a lot of this is conjecture, right? I mean, we're kind of putting together pieces of history, and maybe it happened this way, maybe it's a little different, but we can always see that there's this theme here that God made promises, and it looks like history proves that out. They came to him escorted by soldiers. Okay? How was it that King Herod was afraid and greatly afraid, and all Jerusalem with him? King Herod remembers when his crown was taken away. He was getting to be an old man now, and he didn't live too much long after Jesus was born, but he was getting to be an old man. He could still remember 35 years ago. Some of you can remember 35 years ago. Even I can remember 35 years ago. And he could remember when these guys came into town and whipped him, and he was in serious trouble. And everything that he lived for, everything that he murdered for and assassinated people for, was to keep power over Judea. And he was terrified. Now, one more thing I'll tell you, that Josephus records a couple of things, instances, this is just kind of in passing. One is that there was an ambassador going to the Far East, and we have records that he was escorted by 10,000, a caravan of 10,000 cavalry. I mean, this would be like, some ambassador to a foreign nation going through. Jerusalem was used to seeing large numbers of people coming through, so why would just 3 guys even make a ripple? It had to have been a lot bigger than that. And we also know, Josephus writes, that the offerings that were made by the Jews in the East we're talking about coin offerings of money, were brought by a very large guard of militia, tens of thousands. And so it's quite possible that these guys came with all the pomp and circumstance of the royal court. They came with a huge entourage of military. They were coming looking for a king. And they were there looking for the king of the Jews. And where did they come? Herod. They say, "Hey, Herod, we hear that there's been a new king of the Jews born." And he was furious inside, but he kept his cool. Why did he keep his cool? If he really believed them, and it was just the 3 guys, then he would have silenced them so fast, there would have been no record of it. But he was very accommodating. He said, "Oh, you guys go ahead and you go find him. When you find him, come tell me, because I want to come worship him too. Because I know that's what you're here for." They weren't just looking for a king. They were coming to worship the Messiah. Herod was a lunatic, and nobody was going to stop him. Nobody was going to try to stop him, but he kept his cool in the presence of these guys. It tells you something about the power that they had. It tells you something about the physical force that was there with him. He was very respectful. He was very near death. I mean, he knew that what these guys could do, because they had totally defeated his army in just his lifetime. Herod was near death. He was a weak old man. Caesar Augustus was an old man. The great general Tiberius had just retired, and he had very little protection in his precious city. And the time was ripe for a new attack to come, and he could have seen it, or probably the Jews or the people in Jerusalem could have seen this as kind of a treaty violation. You see this huge entourage coming with enough power to make Herod afraid, and you see all of Jerusalem was afraid with him because they didn't know what this meant. And into Jerusalem comes this band of worshipers, this band of kingmakers who were honorable and who were God-fearing. They were deeply religious, and they have come knowing full well the prophecy that had come down to them from their ancient chief, Daniel. And no matter how much their society had fallen away from God, no matter how much their monarchy had fallen away from God's favor, no matter how much they had degenerated as a people, and there remained a portion of the Magi who kept the true faith. And they had the promises given to Abraham, the promises given to David, that he should always have a king over the house of Israel. And that's what I really want to encourage you with today, is that sometimes it's nice to get like the rest of the story. And I don't know if this is all of the story, or if all of this story is right, but there's enough of the story here that we can believe that, history proves out that God's hand has always been in it. God has always had his hand in the affairs of men. And even the littlest promises, like that in Isaac your seed shall be called. Don't worry. Well, we see the name Isaac and the names of Isaac and his descendants all throughout the kings of the world. The visit of the Magi makes no sense unless the Parthians were descended from the house of Israel. What did Christ say? I am come to the lost tribe of the house of Israel. And it makes no sense unless the Magi included some of that hereditary priesthood of the Israelites, that is, the Levites, who still knew the truth, and they came to worship and honor the one true God and his Son who had come, who was worthy of being the king. He was worthy to be the king of the Parthians. He was worthy to be the king of every other Israelite nation. And they knew it. So that's what I want to encourage you with today, is God's promises are always true. He will always keep them. And when Christ said he came to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, that's exactly what he meant. So, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the material here comes from the work that Stephen Collins has done. I also use a lot of references out of his bibliographies as well, and some other sources. But it's encouraging. I'm kind of a history junkie when it comes to learning how God's hand has been involved. So, are there any questions, comments? Yes, sir.
I'm wondering, let's take these wise men that came to visit Christ and worship. Would they have a role in the government, like a high role, sort of like oligarchs around? Oh, thank you. Thank you.
There we go.
Would they have an elevated role in government, as sort of like oligarchs around the emperor or the king? Or, in other words, you've indicated that they wield some kind of power. In order to have power that makes kings afraid, obviously they have some military might. So what exactly is their role?
How is that? Yeah, what is their role? So one of the things that they did. Well, if you look to what we see as a kind of as a model of the Middle Ages, where you had individual, lords, and then their what am I trying to say? Like, like the title of barons, or you see this ruling class with many subjects. And so one of the things that they did, one of the roles that they had, was actually to bring to raise up the body of the military. So they had, if there were several rulers, they each had, men detainers that they could pull from, and they composed a large body of the cavalry. So they could actually be the military might if they needed it.
So would you then say that Magi were maybe sort of like captains, lieutenants, generals in their own right?
Possibly, yeah. Yes.
So I have kind of studied a little bit of this a long time ago, and I had come across something about these magi had studied under David through the year, not David, I'm sorry, Daniel through the years, and also that some of the items that were taken from the temple when they were taken into captivity, Daniel was an overseer of some of these items, and that maybe some of those gifts were actually gifts from that time. I don't know.
That's fascinating. I've never heard that, but that's...
And that also that there was so much wealth in all of that it gave Joseph the means to take his family into Egypt so abruptly. But anyway, I don't know what you thought about that.
Yeah, that's certainly, I don't know about the first comment. That's
I don't know
very
if there's
interesting.
any way to actually prove that.
Yeah,
It's interesting to think about.
But as far as having enough wealth from these gifts to go to Egypt, that's certainly one possibility of how they were able to live in Egypt. It may be that Joseph was independently wealthy, but... Yeah. Well, if we go back to the beginning of the story, we read Matthew chapter 2, and we see that they came to worship, they came to believe, they believed in God, they were true to Him, and then you realize who they were, that the word means magi, and you realize what these people were and what their role was, and we can kind of fill in ideas for how the rest might fill in, but that's the key that we really know, that there really was some core remnant of these people who believed in God.
Yeah, it gets tricky tracing some of these things down through history, and I've read some of Steve's stuff, and as much as we'd love to trace Israel, it is hard.
It's very hard.
We can at least have confidence that God says He'll draw them together. But just to throw the quick timeline together, when you start with, Judah being taken in the 500s, the 580s, let's say, plus or minus 10, whatever it was. They then get taken by the Persians 50 or so years later, still in the 500s. The Persians rule the East until the Greeks come along and Alexander pushes them back in the 300s. And it is the Parthians that basically take the Persian Empire back from the Greeks. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole lot of conquest, a whole lot of killing, and being able to trace history through the historians of each empire. I mean, you were quoting Herodotus. Herodotus is a well-recognized historian. When you get back, as you know, when you get back about 200 BCE, historians get to be few and far between, and there's a whole lot of speculation. So
that's right.
It's hard to say that Daniel lived in the 500s. These guys didn't show up for 250 years later.
That's right.
So there's no doubt that the Assyrian Empire took the 10 tribes to this part of the world, to what became the Persian Empire, and they got scattered around. But a lot of guys have written a lot of books on tracing them, and it's hard to lace that history together.
It is. It's very hard. And thank you for bringing that up. Maybe I didn't emphasize that strongly enough that, this is, you have to use quite a bit of conjecture, really. I mean, there's speculation in there, and I don't mean to elevate that above what it is. I really don't mean to elevate any of this above that. This is an idea, and it's an interesting study to show that God, as a way to show that God has kept His promises. Am I saying this right? I mean, God, He still will. He knows where they are. Yeah, but as we read from Colossians 3, I mean, that's not the key part, right? But the key part is that we are in Christ. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Oh, one more thing.
So, Graham, when you strategically and so well brought out that scripture in Genesis where God told Abraham to listen to your wife.
Yeah.
And you shared that. I felt like you were the fourth wise man today.
Yeah, there you go. Right, there you go. I know where that went. It's got to be in here somewhere. That's probably the best thing of the whole message, right? There you go. There it is. Well, thank you.